All right, hi everybody, John Meadows here, and I'm here with my buddy Dr. Scott Stevenson. And the topic for today is can stretching or being more flexible give you more gains? Like if you're more flexible, can muscle grow better? So I think it's a great topic. People ask about flexibility all the time. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, does it help, yes or no?
Okay, so two big things, actually maybe three even, pop into my head. First and foremost, muscle length is important for muscle size. So if any of you out there have had your arms casted, for instance, if you had to have a sling put on, let's say you had an AC joint separation like they had to be in a sling, the biceps muscle, the one that's shortened, will atrophy more than the one that's lengthened. If anyone knows someone who had a spinal cord injury, for instance, and they're in a chair, and maybe they don't use spasticity medications, and they tend to plantar flex, or their toes are pointed, the anterior tibialis muscle, and those individuals could even have complete paralysis. So there's no muscle activity. You got disuse atrophy galore. That anterior tibialis muscle that's on stretch, the one that normally would pull your toe up, will be just about the same size as normal people who walk around. But the plantar flexor muscles, the quote-unquote calf muscles, the big ones, those will be small. So there's something to say for muscle length and muscle size, most definitely. You can imagine if you just had a muscle that was this long and it was shaped in a certain way, like a fusiform muscle, you're kind of as the heads of the bicep are, and you looked at the muscle mass of that muscle and then had a muscle that was longer, same muscle, same person, it just was longer all the time, that muscle is going to be larger, especially when you shorten it down. So having a muscle at a longer length is going to tend to make that muscle larger, increase its size. So one thing is another example. Now my mind's sort of running on to some other topics. And I had the same issue myself. We talked about this yesterday in our seminar. Someone who has a weak chest a lot of times will have poor posture like this, or they spend a lot of time here. That muscle, the pecs, are then shortened all the time. So the fibers can get shorter, and you're basically setting the muscle up to work in a shorter range of motion. This will be a whole other topic, but there's a length tension relationship with muscle. So muscle's smart. It knows where its active range of motion needs to be. If it's going to be shorter all the time, it will shorten the fiber. It'll make the sarcomeres, it'll change the length of the sarcomeres. The fibers lengths will be different, and you'll have just smaller muscle because you've got a shorter range of motion. And there's a certain architecture the muscle has just genetically, because muscles are shaped differently because of the genetic programming that makes them which muscles they are. So muscle length is important, and that's somewhat of a postural thing with someone who's been cast, or someone who's been in a wheelchair, or someone who's at their desk, slumped a lot, what have you. So having the flexibility, and of course the overall skeletal health to have good posture, so the muscles are not shortened in a bad position, is important for muscle length, for muscle size. The second thing, the big thing that pops into my head when you ask that question, John, is something that's in part of fortitude training that I incorporate as literally a stimulus for muscle growth. And that is the idea that you can create a metabolic stress stimulus for muscle growth by doing a loaded stretch or producing a contraction under stretch. So you could, for instance, if you're going to do something for the pecs, you grab some dumbbells that aren't extraordinarily heavy and go into a stretch position, hold them. In dog crab training, this was an extreme stretch. I call it an extreme stretch too in fortitude training. You could also do what I call an occlusion stretch, where you bring a muscle into a stretch position and contract it. You go over like about 60% of a maximal effort, a maximal voluntary contraction, you're not going to get any blood flow into that muscle. So metabolites are going to accumulate and it's going to burn. And that is one thing that several lines of research suggest is important for muscle growth. So stretching under load or while contracting is a way to produce muscle growth, and also it's very likely a way, my guess is at least, to potentially protect against injury. So there's an angle specificity of training. There's been several studies have been done where they have people, for instance, train like the knee extensors. You can train to isometric contractions with the knee bent at 90 or at 45 degrees or closer to full extension. If you just have them train at those angles, that's where the strength gains will happen. So you train at with a bent knee, you'll get stronger with a bent knee, but not so much when your knee's near full extension. So your nervous system learns based on the task it's been given. So if you are doing stretches on a regular basis to produce muscle growth, let's say in this position, in this stretched out position, which is one that could be the one where you most likely might injure yourself, you're learning how to produce force and get stronger in that position, which could protect against injury. So if you're injured, you can't grow muscle. An injured muscle or a pulled muscle is not going to be a larger muscle. That's super important. So you can use stretching with metabolic stress under load or just contracting under the stretch to produce muscle growth, potentially protect against injury. And that, of course, would then increase your flexibility to some degree. Note, the idea would not be to try to go like beyond your normal levels of range of motion with a huge load to produce flexibility. That's asking for injury. If you want to stretch to increase flexibility, probably best to do that just unloaded in a passive way or with someone helping, massage therapist to help you with the stretching. But stretching under load is a way to potentially protect against injury and produce muscle growth. And if you're more flexible, the muscle will tend to be longer. A longer muscle is going to tend to be a larger muscle. So those are two main ways that stretching and flexibility could produce muscle growth.
Yeah, and so I want to add in here, one of the things that I always think about too is if you're going through a long range of motion, you might have some kind of regional specific growth to, like, say, a hamstring. Like if you're going through a long range of motion on it, you might get a little bit more development at the bottom of your hamstring. Like on a leg curl, if you're really going down all the way. For your chest, if you're getting a really good range of motion, you might get a little bit more development regionally. I've talked about that with Brad Schoenfeld. He's actually demonstrated that in some of his work. The other thing I would say too is, people will see us doing something with a shorter range of motion, and everybody's real black and white. They'll be like, oh, you should never train with a short range of motion. And what we're saying is that there are definitely benefits of using a full range of motion. It doesn't mean everything you do has to be a wildly full range of motion. But it's only going to help you if you're more flexible. The other thing I would say is probably the common question I get, and I think it's good for people to hear, is people always ask, when should I do the stretching if it's passive? So Scotty has talked a lot about under load. Well, what about passive stretching? Should you do it beforehand or afterhand? And, based on my experience and what I've read, I always feel really good stretching a pumped muscle or somewhere later in the workout or even after the workout. I feel like it's also helped with recovery. And so I feel like that's a good time. But I feel like when I push the stretching really hard and intense before training, I always felt joint instability. And I remember Tom Platz talking about ankle flexibility when you squatted. So I loaded up the seated calf, and I'm stretching the hell out of my Achilles tendon and my ankles. And when I went down, I definitely went down further.
Right.
And then, boom, pulled adductor.
Yeah. You lost stability.
I lost stability. I did the same thing. One time I overstretched my quads, just stretched them like crazy before I went and did some leg presses. I got on a leg press, and my legs were going valgus and varus. I lost control. Like my knees were going like this.
Right.
And it was scary. I was like, man, something's going to blow off. So I always felt like that hard passive stretching is a little dangerous beforehand. I'm not talking about just that. I'm talking about a hard passive stretch.
Yeah.
Always felt like that was a little dangerous beforehand, but afterhand it always felt fantastic.
Yeah, the research with aggressive stretching supports a reduction in performance, and you're probably dampening the stretch reflex a little bit, and that's part of it. So normally that stretch reflex, like when your knees are going back and forth, when you're on a leg press, the stretch reflex would normally prevent that, keep them in line. Yeah, you said so much, John. There's Jose Antonio actually has a really nice article on basically using a variety of exercise to produce sort of regional muscle growth. And the bottom line there is that different exercises are going to have different activation patterns. And along the length of a muscle, it depends on what the architecture of muscle is, but the fibers don't go the full length. At one point, years ago, people just sort of assumed that a fiber ran from tendon to tendon, but they don't necessarily. So some fibers can be short, they can be interwoven with one another, and the activation pattern will activate motor units that are regional to different parts of the muscle. So it definitely, this is something you'll see, different, in fact, I posted yesterday in our talk, one of the figures that I had showed an increase in muscle size in the middle part of the muscle, not so much on the end. But I haven't seen anyone try to use different exercise selections specifically to target different areas of the muscle, but theoretically there's definitely some rationale for why that would happen. And the other thing about training with partial range of motion is that, and this has to do with machines and the mechanics that are there and the mind-muscle connection, which is so important. So sometimes you'll get a machine, let's say it's a chest press machine, and just something about the machine, the loading just does not match the strength curve you would have. So if you're doing a press and you're trying to use it to increase your pec size, you want the pec to be the prime mover. You want a mind-muscle connection with the pec. But if the machine is so difficult, let's say at the beginning, that you have to engage your anterior deltoids and triceps just to get the weight moving because the leverage of the machine is poor, then you lose that mind-muscle connection, and that's no longer a good pec builder. That's not targeting the pec, basically your weak link. You're probably going to fail at that point in the range of motion. Your set will terminate there because these are the prime movers and those are the ones that are failing. But you might find, and every once in a while you find a machine like this where there's a portion of the range of motion. A lot of guys will do this with bench press. You see a lot of guys who they're doing an incline press. They don't go all the way down to their chest because they feel a better connection in that middle range of motion. For them, that's what works. For their biomechanics, for their nervous system. So they train in the range of motion where they feel the best connection with the muscle, and there's definitely research suggesting that you can do that. You can ask people to say, okay, use your pecs on this bench press, and the EMG will reflect that they've done that. And you can say, okay, now use your triceps on this bench press, and the EMG will reflect that they've done that. So training in the range of motion, or the portion of the range of motion that you feel the best connection with the muscle, makes total sense.
Yeah.
Why would you not?
Absolutely.
Why would you purposely just say, well, I have to do full range of motion,
Right.
and it means that this becomes an anterior delt, not a pec exercise? That's just silly.
Right.
So use the machines smartly, intelligently to your advantage to get the training effect that you want. That's what I say.
Yeah.
So.
All right, guys, there you go. Comment below, let us know what you think. As always, I appreciate you watching. So for my good friend, Dr. Scott Stevenson, we'll see you next time.
Stretch for gains.